All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the May 9th meeting of the Gateway API Gamma Initiative. Um, as always, Kubernetes Code of Conduct rules apply, so please treat each other respectfully. And the meeting notes should be linked in the event invite. And please feel free to add your name to the list of attendees. We are still doing meetings at alternating times, so we try to have an EU-friendly time and a US West Coast friendlier time on alternating weeks. So it's definitely helpful for us to get a good idea of who's able to attend each of these meetings to ensure that maintaining this kind of schedule makes sense. And also just a pitch, the regular Gateway API meeting, which has typically been pretty late in the evening for EU folks, is next week going to be at a similar time slot to this meeting. I think it is going to be 30 minutes earlier than this next week. So avoiding conflicts with Gamma, avoiding conflicts with SIG multicluster, and it'll be trialing a new time slot for the main Gateway API meeting to hopefully make it more accessible for EU time zone folks to be able to join. All right. And as always, we have an open agenda, so please feel free to add any topics that you'd like to discuss to the meeting notes. And with that, I can get started. I'm assuming that the topic that I have to discuss will take a bit longer. So if Rob, you want to pitch a few smaller things first to get some of the housekeeping out of the way, feel free to do that.
I'll get unmuted eventually. Okay. Yeah, hopefully we're good. All right. So first up, yeah, what you already mentioned, the next Gateway API meeting, it is actually 30 minutes later than our start time now. So 25 minutes from now, a week from now, is when that meeting will start. Then next up, the RC2 of the 0.7.0 is almost ready. We realized a little too late that, well, a little later than I would have liked, that we missed a pretty big detail around redirect clarification. The PR I linked in the agenda covers that. Just if you have any opinions, please get them in the next few hours. We already have a couple approvals on that. So it is going to merge soon. And once that merges, we're going to turn around and get RC2 out pretty quick. And RC2, I expect, will be our last RC before the final release. So yeah, that's the updates overall. And hopefully some of this group can make it to the main Gateway API meeting next week.
Awesome. Yeah, I am hopeful that that will be something that, yeah, enables more folks to be able to join and get crossover attendance for relevant topics, because I know we've had a few. All right. With that, someone bumped. So
I just moved the agenda to let John also go before.
oh yeah, is he on the call? Okay.
Yeah, I'm here. I don't think I put this, so someone wanted me to talk about it.
I just added it. I just added it.
Okay.
Like, remember my DM.
Yeah, so I forget if they were approved or not, but I sent some PRs to move the GEPs from provisional to implementable, which I think really just represents kind of the current state. We've been in that state really for a while. We have, I think, 3 implementations now. So we're kind of at the point now where we have multiple implementations. We have conformance tests. I think we should start progressing to officially experimental shortly after, maybe in the 0.8 timeframe. So if you've been holding on to opinions about how the spec is entirely wrong and we should change everything, speak now. It seems like we have mostly a consensus on at least the broader details. Experimental is also not locked in stone, but it's, you know, the first step to getting to something that is locked in stone. So I think that's kind of the current status.
Yeah, I don't think anything is merged on that front, but I think it's still, at least from my perspective, I was waiting till we had at least one Gamma meeting, so we could clearly announce it and give anyone a chance to have any comments. But I think we already have a few people that have approved it. It's just got a hold on it that will probably be removed today as well. The
I'm actually
reason,
really curious now to see if anybody comes out of the woodwork saying, I think everything is totally wrong.
right? You never know. The reason that it's going to implementable and experimental is, at least historically, experimental has been included in a release. Experimental refers to experimental release channel. Trying to get 0.7.0 out before adding scope to it, but I think it largely meets the criteria of experimental too. So I think we should be able to turn around and make another, release pretty quickly that just says, by the way, Gamma is experimental. I think it's more of a formality. It's not really like we're not changing the API. We're just saying this is a thing that exists and we should probably have a release or something for that. But open to feedback on
I think there will probably also be Go doc updates on how the
Yep.
fields can be used, but
Yep.
I don't think any API changes. So
Yeah. That sounds right to me. And yeah, I'll add a note.
we should
Right.
maybe have on the implementations page. Well, I don't know. I guess somewhere on the implementations page, we should mention which ones implement the mesh spec versus the gateway spec.
Yeah, I think the entire Gateway API implementations page needs some significant
Okay,
updates
yeah.
because we have some implementations on there that are still, work in progress, haven't released anything. We have some that have, are fully conformant, and then we have some that are also doing mesh, and some that are only doing mesh, and we don't really have a good way to represent any of those states. So, yeah, I'm sure others have opinions on this too, but we need some cleanup around that.
Cool. I can try to take care of at least getting issues opened in the Gamma ready for implementers milestone, which maybe changes to Gamma ready for experimental milestone or something like that. For implementations page updates and Go doc updates for the relevant resources. All right. So yeah, this is a topic that I had planned to discuss, and it has been through several revisions and a lot of figuring out what is reasonable, what is practical, and with internal and external conversations to kind of figure out how do we route to services across mesh boundaries. So the goal of this is to make routing to services in the mesh work in a predictable and sensible manner. I think the difficulty here is that some of what is practical to implement may be at odds with a convenient experience, but there's definitely tension here between different meshes, different implementation details, different assumptions. So there's not going to be a lot of must in this, is kind of the unfortunate reality of it. Some of the constraints that we're dealing with here are some implementations are commonly deployed by, say, like a single cloud vendor, and where you can have an assumption of all of my mesh communication within multiple clusters is happening within a single VPC, so you have a flat network. For other vendors, we're trying to bridge multiple cloud providers in a single mesh, so you don't necessarily have those assumptions. Although you might if you're deploying a CNI underneath. So it's the kind of thing where some of these implementation details end up basically reducing the ability to ensure that you have a consistent experience with how traffic is actually routed from the way in which the configuration is written. I think that's unfortunate, but I don't know how much we can do to prescribe how this is treated, other than basically allowing affordances and accommodations to be able to have different routing behavior depending on mesh implementation details. I think that the goal of this is to get as much as we can towards patterns that are commonly supportable and implementable as should, and then some allowances for how meshes may choose to implement it if certain behaviors are present. So yeah, I have a whole bunch of notes that I'm still in the process of consolidating into a formal GEC here.
Austin,
But
did you have something you wanted to ask there? Or?
Yeah, just a quick comment. Maybe it would be good to clarify a bit the terms with East-West Gateway and all the other things that we're discussing, because there's a
Yes.
huge amount of confusion and things in reality are much simpler than they look. I mean, if you ignore the the sea of terms that we invented and confusion and kind of if you for example, for East-West Gateway, I mean, is Gateway API restricted to only public internet addresses and not allowed to represent East-West gateways? Do we need to have a different concept for East-West Gateway for mesh, or I don't know?
Yeah,
I think what Mike and I were trying to look at here was more, if you have a north-south gateway that is configured using Gateway API resources, and you also have a service mesh that is configured using Gateway API resources, then where do those two come into conflict?
and in
Michael?
some ways, that turns out to be the easier problem to solve than some of the multi-cluster topology type stuff and East-West gateways.
Yeah, my point was in Istio, in JK, and a lot of probably other places with a Gateway API, you can put an annotation or some other and make it an internal East-West gateway. So there is no difference between East-West and North-South. Both of them can be programmed with a Gateway API, and both of them don't need to be different or treated specially. I agree with you. The problem is, how do you make sure that HTTP route attached to a service is visible to the East-West gateways that you intend to be to use, and also probably to the North-South? I don't know. They're both the same problem to me. Anyway.
Yeah, so for the North-South gateway, sending traffic into the mesh, there's a couple of constraints with mesh routing rules, where basically, because of the architecture of most existing service meshes, their model, typically, although not always, as Istio is trying to do something different with ambient, and I'm not sure what Cilium's doing, but there's often a sidecar proxy model, and some of the constraints of this is that the destination of traffic is often determined in the client sidecar, as programmed from the configuration provided by the mesh control plane. And the destination sidecar, when traffic gets to it, it can determine if it is authorized or not. So it can reject unauthorized traffic there, but it cannot without like introducing it. If it's, you technically could, but I don't think anybody wants to have a sidecar proxy redirect traffic to a different destination in most common cases. So that would be one way to
Wait, define different in this context?
a destination other than the workload to which the destination, the sidecar, the like receiving sidecar proxy is attached. So sending it to potentially a different node if it's trying to apply producer rules. Generally, the most efficient way for traffic to flow through the mesh is to be able to trust that the routing rules as applied to the client sidecar can select an appropriate destination. One way to do that differently is to basically move the destination sidecar up. So like off of the workload itself. So rather than having it like on the node or on the pod even as a sidecar, being able to move that up a level to somewhere like basically like an ingress gateway for a namespace, like a namespace scoped gateway, or a like service account scoped gateway or something like that. And that's sort of like what Ambient's doing, where it could be a place to enforce policy, to enforce traffic routing policy, and it does for basically dumb requests. So inbound requests that don't know what endpoint they're intending to reach. But for requests that know a specific endpoint they're trying to reach, like such as those coming from a gateway or coming from a client sidecar, those are passed through directly. That is an element of flexibility that I guess like for consistency, you don't want to necessarily expect or require that waypoint, that like waypoint like proxy at a boundary like that, because that would be a substantial architectural change for many meshes if it were to require an internal implementation detail for enforcing producer rules in a place like that. Yeah, Costin.
Sorry, you lost me a bit. Are we
Sorry,
still
I'm
talking
rambling.
flat networks, or are we talking about you know, separate VPCs where you don't have a flat network? Because the fundamental problem we had with this is that you don't know how to address it. I mean, how the IP can be duplicated. You have same IP address in two networks. How could the sidecar or the client refer to the destination in a way that will go through you know, egress gateway, and all the middle boxes, nuts and.
Yeah, so like the original scope of this was intended to just be like gateways sending traffic to a service which is in a mesh, and when and where and how mesh scoped rules are applied to that service. Because that's kind of like crossing a boundary from like outside the cluster to inside the mesh, sorry, outside the mesh to inside the mesh, it felt pertinent to also address other issues of like scope and crossing boundaries, such as within the mesh when you may have client routing rules and producer routing rules defined, or when you're crossing boundaries either within a cluster set where you have some assumption of service fungibility and sameness between different clusters, or basically like across a cluster set boundary where you do not have that assumption between different clusters. So the across cluster set where you basically don't have that assumption is pretty straightforward. It basically has to go through some sort of east-west gateway because it should not reasonably have any knowledge of the actual direct endpoint that it's trying to reach, and it needs to have a boundary by which routing rules can be applied to incoming traffic. So that is like a east-west gateway between clusters. It gets fuzzier when you're talking about inside of a cluster set, because if you're building on that existing primitive, as we are, it may be most practical to kind of assume that. It gets more difficult when you start layering in things like replication of routing configuration, because what you want to avoid is having the same configuration applied twice, both at the client sidecar and then also at a like east-west gateway when traffic is transiting between clusters.
Yeah, Mike, I kind of feel like I think we're going to have to remove some of that from the scope of this doc in the interests of being able to finish getting the notes merged in and make some recommendations here.
That's probably
So,
fair. Yeah.
Yeah,
I
so
should probably split into two.
let's figure out some time, since we were not able to figure out time over the past couple of weeks, given various offsites and things like that. Let's figure out some time this week to get back together and, you know, strip some of that out so that we can get this done.
Some warnings here. We kind of tried to do this with Istio with a multi-network support, and because we missed many of the points, we kind of put ourselves in a corner where we have trouble getting out of. So it is very important to consider those corner cases when designing it. Otherwise, you end up with SNI routings that we did or something similar, which we know that it's not going to work.
Yeah.
I think the trick is going to be to make sure that we have restricted scope enough to be able to complete it while also not painting ourselves into corners. So, and I think that's eminently doable here.
That seems reasonable. And I would definitely love to hear from anyone who has experiences of decisions they may have regretted in their own mesh. But yeah, so like kind of what I'm leaning towards is suggesting, not requiring, because some implementations do have a like integrate with north-south gateways through a sidecar proxy deployed next to them. I would suggest though that for implementations that are able to have a north-south gateway and a mesh implementation, that similar to the kind of the consumer routing rules, whether they be from a consumer doing east-west or from a gateway doing north-south to a mesh service destination, should require authorization of some sort. So for north-south, this is handled with reference grant. For east-west, is typically mesh authority policy. And that's something that can be enforced basically like by the owner of the destination to ensure that traffic is allowed to go there. But the actual configuration for determining which rules are followed is typically most practical to implement at the client. That is not necessarily ideal for some user stories, particularly for the ability of mesh or like service owners in a mesh to be able to do something like drain traffic that's inbound to their service and redirect it to avoid service interruption when they're doing something like a blue-green deployment or breaking up a monolith, something like that. It's typically like preferable for a service producer owner to have more control over that. But enforcing, so like that's a pattern that we can guide users towards in terms of like suggestions, but enforcing that basically requires having that traffic transit through a gateway of some sort, be that at a namespace boundary or at an east-west cluster boundary, or redirected through a second hop. And absent that, which is basically it's an indirection that makes it more expensive to use the mesh.
Hang
we
on a
can-
second,
we can-
Mike. I'm
yeah.
not sure I followed.
Yeah,
That was, there were enough words there that I'm not sure I was following what was going on.
that's fair.
It
I'm rambling a
sounds
little
like
bit,
you're,
yeah.
it sounds like you're saying that it would be a good idea. It would be a good idea to be able to arrange it such that traffic coming from your ingress gateway into your mesh is actually has to go through the same auth Z and auth N as traffic normally would within the mesh. Did I hear that right?
No.
Okay.
So the ingress gateway has other controls, typically reference grant. And I don't think we want to like break those existing patterns right now. I'm really not concerned any kind of scope like that. The thing that makes it
Ingress
like,
controllers using gateway API resources will typically have to follow reference grants if they want to be able to deal with gateway API resources in arbitrary namespaces. With you so far?
yes, yes. Yeah.
Don't forget that the workload needs to authenticate that it's talking with the ingress gateway if you want to bypass security rules. So you are saying that, you know,
Yes.
gateway requests don't go through authorizations and you must authenticate the gateways very strongly. Otherwise, anyone can pretend to be a gateway and bypass it. So it's very tricky.
Right. And
Yeah.
typically you would do this by having your gateway, having your ingress controller actually participate in the mesh so that the mesh can do its usual authorization and
exactly.
authentication.
Yeah, and I think there are some existing allowances in the spec for that where it says like or other sufficient authorization policy or something like that. But that was not really the scope I was trying to focus on. It's more of just like where the routing behavior is defined and like how an endpoint is selected. And basically like the way to enforce that, in a mesh, you commonly are trusting the client sidecar to do that with basically like the safety check of the actual authorization is enforced.
No,
Well,
you're generally trusting the sidecar at the recipient workload to manage authorization for traffic coming to that workload.
for
generally-
authorization, yes.
You're generally going to trust you're generally going to assume that the sidecar originating the traffic will do a reasonable job of choosing an endpoint.
Yes, yes,
If you-
exactly.
if
Yeah.
you-
So
if
so
you have
you're
sidecars.
yeah. So you're basically you're splitting the trust model a little bit.
Right.
Like you can enforce like what you can actually enforce is at the destination. And then you can expect reasonable behavior from the client. With kind of like the safety check of you're able to enforce it if something undesirable happens at the destination sidecar.
Are you familiar with the proposal for persistent sessions that is discussed in Gateway? Because that's also very related with selecting the endpoint. Basically using cookies to select it. So basically it's preserving, the idea is how do you talk with a specific IP for a stateful set or persistent session use case, which is very exactly what, you know, kind of client determining the actual endpoints that is talking with. And we are discussing the putting the cookies, so ingress gateway, east-west gateway, and all the other intermediaries consistently allow client to select the destination.
That is definitely another good point. And yeah, that's something.
Do you have a link to that, Custin?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can find the GIP.
Yeah,
That
that is a very explicit case in which you need to have the client able to select the destination.
There are certain cases like this where certain cases like that when they get a little bit interesting, especially viewed through the lens of, you know, the way the various different meshes do that, because yeah, there are pretty easy ways that sidecar based meshes can do that end up being not very easy ways for some of the other meshes to do it. So that's one of the interesting things we run into here. But Mike, I think a lot of this boils down to Yeah, we should come back here. We should sketch out some specific use cases and we should document how those are expected to behave. Because there's an awful lot of vagueness that we can talk about here and we should
That's
avoid that.
fair. Yeah, yeah. And I think the thing that gives me like the most optimism about this is that even if we end up in a place where you're not able to enforce producer routing configuration, you're still able to distribute the ability to author it to the owners of the service. So basically, because of gateway APIs like role-oriented design, you can have a service owner be able to both author the like east-west routing rules for the service and a north-south HTTP route attached to a north-south gateway. So the kind of motivation for how we did this originally in console of having the mesh routing rules always be like relayed as like a second hop after the ingress was in part due to kind of like organizational topology where you had a ingress configuration that had all of north-south routing rules and typically like an external team managing that may be different from the service teams. So being able to at least like have that config distributed, it may be a UX that requires a little more explicit configuration, but the hope is that it at least allows the relevant parties to be able to have sufficient control over the resources under their management to like accomplish the tasks that they want to do. So
Yeah, we definitely
yeah.
we definitely have to make sure that those things happen.
I'm curious, how open would people be to agree on a common protocol? I mean, similar with what we are trying with HTTP to connect or mask or some standard, so we can represent East-West Gateway as a protocol, and then different implementation can interoperate with each other's East-West gateways. And
You know, I'm not gonna lie, I have not been thinking much about East-West gateways yet in this context, mostly because every time I start thinking about East-West gateways, I get bound up with egress rules and controls, and I don't want to think about that right now because there's enough without thinking about it. I think if I start thinking too much about that, that will not be in service of my stated goal earlier of actually completing this document and getting it into people's hands. So I want to think about that as a follow-on thing.
But it's good to think in context of egress as well, because egress gateways also have some constraints. I mean, some requirements that, you know, there are existing egress gateways that are based on and require HTTP connect and all that.
I don't think that Gamma as a whole has put enough consideration into egress gateways for us to meaningfully consider that within the scope of this document. I completely agree that we should try to not paint ourselves into corners around it, and that Gamma as a whole needs to put more thought into that. But I don't think we've had enough conversation about that right now to have it be a meaningful part of the scope for this GEP.
I would love to talk about that in a future GEP.
Yeah.
It is something that we do have an implementation of in console. I know that we probably have a bespoke protocol that probably differs from what Istio is doing for some things like this, but having a path to converge on a design for East-West gateways to be able to have a consistent way for routing traffic to a known endpoint versus routing traffic and allowing the East-West gateway to direct it as appropriate is definitely something that we would have an interest in collaborating on.
Likewise.
But
and
yeah,
I think that's
okay, cool.
I think that's a good one to put on the agenda for later meetings for sure. Yeah. I don't know that there's much else we can meaningfully say about this particular GEP that Mike was talking about. Yeah, Was there anything else for today?
So I guess today I was just trying to kind of give an overview of where I've gotten to so far. And raise like attention and awareness on that. And what I would like to do is finally get this gap opened up and share it out for broader review. And it possibly makes sense to split it up into a multi-cluster use cases and a cluster internal one. If that may be a more pragmatic way to start getting these shipped, but yeah, basically differentiating between routing behavior and actual authorization, like traffic policy auth behavior, I think is important, and making sure that I think we are going to, even if we have like client-defined routing behavior, where the client is either the gateway or client-defined routing rules. I think that the design of Gateway API is going to allow us to still achieve the kind of user stories that we hope for. So, yeah.
So yeah, Mike, once we get off this call, let's immediately go over and schedule when we're gonna do the next work on this.
That sounds good. And I guess kind of like at this point, I'm curious to hear from anyone who has immediate thoughts on this or a perspective that they'd like to contribute to it, kind of before we wrap up this discussion. And if that is just, I want to see the doc, then that's fine. I can make that happen. All right, well, apologies for rambling so long. Hopefully there will be something to actually review in the very near future. It has taken a lot of
Way too
iteration to to get to a point, but I think it's just been kind of the tension between finding a reasonable way to achieve the UX we want within the constraints of making sure that this is something that will be implementable across all the meshes that are participating in this. And yeah, thank you everyone. And we have about 20 minutes left, but I'll pause for a moment in case anyone has other topics they want to raise during this time. But if not, we can wrap up a little bit early today.
I just had a
Anyone?
question, kind of like a survey. Is anyone doing kind of like a open policy plugin for, I guess this applies to like any gateway stuff like north, south, east, west things?
I
Just
don't
curious.
know of anyone doing such a thing.
I saw a
Like,
blog post.
okay. Go ahead, sorry.
I was saying I just saw a blog post someone doing it with Istio and Envoy filters. I
Wow.
was just wondering if people were thinking about this broadly.
Can you link?
I certainly think it's an interesting idea. There's the whole policy enforcement thing is interesting, right? And getting to a place where you could use open policy to go and create gateway API policy. And I'd like to point out, I am using policy in the sense of the English word here, not the term of art related to attaching things. Definitely seems like something that would be interesting to do. Not gonna lie, the idea of taking open policy stuff and translating it into Envoy filters kind of scares me, but that's for very different reasons that have nothing to do with Gamma.
I think the filter just reaches out to the OPA endpoint to apply rules. So just curious.
That scares me a lot less, for the record. Thanks for the
Yeah,
link. I
open
just copied that into the doc.
The open service messages does something like this as well without Envoy filter. And I didn't think Istio's external auth required Envoy filter, but I might be wrong on that. I think this is just sending, because Envoy's got native support for sending a request to an external auth server. So it's for Envoy specifically, it's not too difficult. For something like Gamma, it gets a little more complicated because not every data plane has a built-in external auth server construct. So it gets it gets difficult to try to design a spec way to implement that.
Yeah. There's data plane extensions in the critical path of the data plane are a fascinating thing to discuss. Yeah, that's a good way for me to put that.
Yeah, I'll
That
just
would be interesting.
just
Go ahead.
dig back into some historical context here. Let me link into the agenda actually. Oh, sorry, Mike. I'll go above you. Just
You're fine.
so yeah, way back in the day, and actually I think our doc's still linked to this somewhere. We had a OPA policy that never ended up getting merged in the Gatekeeper library, but the idea was that we wanted to provide a way to restrict where specific gateway classes could be used by namespace.
Mhm.
And instead of trying to build that into the API, the suggestion was maybe we could use this as proof of concept for using policy, like OPA specifically. So this is what we did. It just got stuck and frozen in time, but that's fine. But it's just an example of, I think there are some valid use cases where we don't want to rely on API, but we
Mhm.
could have some standard OPA policies for that.
Yeah, that definitely feels encouraging to me. Similar to some of the other policy stuff that we've talked about with like timeouts and retries, where we have extended conformance things that are maybe defined within the scope of, say, like OPA in this case. Maybe like those aren't necessarily things that live in Gateway API themselves, but maybe if OPA defines something that follows a like policy attachment that is like an implementation of policy attachment CRDs or the direct policy attachment or something like that. That could be a neat opportunity for meshes to choose to implement those.
There is some discussion on the chat. Maybe, I know not all meshes support external authorization or something like that, but maybe we should have some common API for all meshes that do have the concept of delegated IAM. So agents like OPA can be written in a vendor neutral way for the subset of vendors that may support this.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that update. I think it's a really interesting question around potential like future extensibility and some of the like ecosystem benefits that we may unlock by being able to have extensive like patterns for extensibility like this.
Yeah, no worries. I was just curious.
All right. Well, with that, I'm going to wrap it up for the day. Thank you, everyone, for listening to me ramble. And hopefully, we'll get something more concrete available for review soon. But it does feel like we're actually making progress on getting to a thing that is a distillation of what is implementable and pragmatic in terms of the UX that we can offer. So thank you for your patience, and hopefully it feels like we're continuing to make progress and hopefully near being able to get Gamma promoted to either implementable and or experimental in the near future. So definitely appreciate all the work of folks who have contributed to getting us this far and to getting us not over the finish line, but to getting us to the next step. So thank you so
Getting
much.
us to the
Take
next
care.
milestone.
Yeah, next milestone. Thank you
Thanks
so
so
much.
much.
Take care and have a good rest of your day, y'all.